He ran away for 4 years over a lie, but the new bride did something unbelievable on Christmas night. A true love story. Welcome to Peter Stories. Dear story lovers, on this magical Christmas season, I'm delighted to welcome you to our cozy corner of storytelling. Each story here is crafted with love, hoping to bring warmth and joy to your day. Thank you for being part of our growing family of readers. If these tales touch your heart, simply comment yes below and share your rating out of 10. Wishing you all a wonderful Christmas filled with magical moments. With love, Peter, let's begin. It was a cold December night in 1990. Winslet, Edinburgh, stood at the door of her lavish home, shouting in anguish, "Dashiell Merrick, you're a cheater! I don't want to see you again in my life. You've destroyed our marriage. I never expected this from you. I loved you more than anyone in the world." Her voice cracked with pain as she slammed the door shut, leaving an envelope on the table. She stormed out into the biting cold, leaving behind a shattered Dashiell Merrick. 4 years ago, the throbbing bass of rock music pulsed through the air like a living heartbeat, reverberating off the walls of the prestigious Morgan Concert Hall. Outside, the December wind of 1990 howled through the streets of downtown, but inside, the atmosphere was electric with youth, music, and possibility. Crystal chandeliers cast their golden glow over the crowd below, their light catching on sequined dresses and polished cufflinks, creating a dreamlike atmosphere that would forever be etched in the memories of two souls destined to meet. Winslet, Edinburgh, stood near the edge of the dance floor, her slender fingers wrapped around a half-empty champagne glass. At 18, she possessed the kind of beauty that turned heads. Warm, brown skin that seemed to glow from within, eyes the color of rich honey, and a smile that could illuminate the darkest corners of any room. Her dark hair cascaded down her back in perfectly styled waves, and the burgundy cocktail dress she wore complemented her figure perfectly, though she now wished she'd chosen something less eye-catching. The world around her had begun to spin slightly, the result of 3 glasses of champagne and the intoxicating atmosphere of the concert hall. It was her first time at such an upscale event, a celebration of classical meets contemporary music that had drawn Manhattan's elite. She'd only managed to secure an invitation through her work as an intern at a prestigious art gallery, where one of the wealthy patrons had taken a liking to her enthusiasm for the arts. "Hey, beautiful," a voice slurred from behind her, causing her to stiffen. "Why are you standing here all alone?" Winslet turned to find 3 men in expensive suits, their ties loosened and their eyes glazed with alcohol. The speaker, a tall man with slicked-back brown hair, wore a predatory smile that made her stomach turn. She took an instinctive step backward, only to feel the solid presence of a wall behind her. "I'm waiting for someone," she lied, trying to keep her voice steady, despite the fear beginning to curl in her chest. The champagne that had made her feel so sophisticated and grown up mere moments ago now left her feeling vulnerable and slow. The man laughed, the sound lacking any real humor. "Come on, don't be like that. We just want to talk." He reached out, his fingers brushing against her bare arm. Winslet jerked away, but the movement caused her to stumble slightly in her high heels. "Please, leave me alone," she said more firmly, though her voice trembled. The other 2 men had moved to flank their friend, effectively boxing her in. The music seemed to grow louder, drowning out any hope of someone overhearing her distress. "Look at this one, playing hard to get," the second man sneered, his breath reeking of expensive scotch. "Bet you snuck in here, didn't you? Pretty little thing like you doesn't belong in a place like this." Tears pricked at the corners of Winslet's eyes as panic began to set in. The crowd continued to dance and laugh mere feet away, oblivious to her situation. She searched desperately for a familiar face, a security guard, anyone who might help. But the sea of strangers offered no salvation. I said, leave me alone. She tried to push past them, but the first man grabbed her wrist, causing her to drop her champagne glass. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound lost in the music. Now look what you made her do, the third man laughed, his eyes roving over her figure in a way that made her skin crawl. Guess you'll have to make it up to us. Just as Winslate opened her mouth to scream, a commanding voice cut through the chaos like a blade. I believe the lady asked you to leave her alone. The crowd seemed to part like the Red Sea, revealing a tall figure striding purposefully toward them. Dashiell Merrick moved with the confidence of someone who commanded respect wherever he went, his expensive black suit fitting his athletic frame perfectly. At 25, he had already made a name for himself in the business world, his reputation as a self-made millionaire preceding him in most social circles. But it wasn't his wealth that struck Winslate in that moment, it was his presence. Dark hair swept back from a face that seemed carved from marble, eyes the color of storm clouds fixed firmly on the men surrounding her. His jaw was set in a hard line, and despite the refined cut of his suit, there was something dangerous in his bearing that made the three men take an involuntary step back. Mind your own business, Merrick, the first man spat, though his grip on Winslate's wrist loosened slightly. We're just having a friendly conversation. Dashiell's eyes flickered to Winslate's face, noting the tears threatening to spill onto her cheeks, before returning to the men with glacial coldness. It doesn't look very friendly to me. He took another step forward, and even through her fear, Winslate could see why this man had become so successful at such a young age. Power radiated from him like heat from a flame. Last chance, Dashiell continued, his voice deceptively calm. Walk away now. The first man's face contorted with rage and alcohol-fueled bravado. He released Winslate's wrist to swing at Dashiell, but the punch never landed. In a blur of motion that seemed impossible for someone in such fine clothing, Dashiell dodged the clumsy attack and returned with one of his own. His fist connected with the man's jaw with a crack that Winslate felt in her bones. The other two men rushed forward, but they were no match for Dashiell's practiced efficiency. One received an elbow to the solar plexus that left him gasping for air, while the other found himself thrown against the wall with enough force to rattle the nearby paintings. Security finally began to push through the crowd that had gathered to watch the commotion. "Are you all right?" Dashiell asked, turning to Winslate with genuine concern in his eyes. Up close, she could see flecks of silver in their grey depths, like stars in a stormy sky. His hand, when he offered it to her, was warm and steady. Yes, she managed, though her voice shook. Thank you. The security guards had reached them now, and Dashiell spoke quietly but authoritatively to them, explaining the situation. Winslate watched in a daze as her attackers were escorted from the premises, their protests falling on deaf ears. "Let me drive you home," Dashiell said, turning back to her. It wasn't quite a question, but his tone made it clear she could refuse if she wished. "You've had a shock, and I'd feel better knowing you got home safely." Under normal circumstances, Winslate would never have accepted a ride from a stranger, no matter how heroic. But something in his eyes, something genuine and honorable, made her nod. "Thank you, that would be very kind." He led her through the crowd, his hand hovering near the small of her back, but never quite touching her, responsible even in his chivalry. When they reached the entrance, he shrugged out of his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders to protect her from the December chill. The fabric was warm from his body and carried the subtle scent of expensive cologne. A sleek Acura NSX waited at the curb, its black paint gleaming under the streetlights like liquid obsidian. Dashiell opened the passenger door for her, waiting until she was settled before closing it gently and walking around to the driver's side. The interior was all soft leather and polished surfaces, but Winslate barely noticed the luxury. Her mind was still spinning from the events of the evening, from terror to rescue in the space of minutes. They drove in comfortable silence, the city lights painting streaks of color across the windshield. Dashiell handled the car with the same quiet confidence he seemed to approach everything else, navigating the late-night traffic with ease. Winslade found herself stealing glances at his profile, trying to reconcile this sophisticated man with the fighter who had come to her rescue. "Thank you," she said again, breaking the silence as they neared her neighborhood. Not many people would have gotten involved like that. Dashiell's lips curved into a slight smile, though his eyes remained focused on the road. Not many people would have had the courage to stand up to those men like you did. You were scared, but you didn't back down. That's admirable. His words warmed something inside her, chasing away the last of her fear. When they pulled up to her apartment building, a modest but well-maintained structure in a respectable part of town, Winslade found herself reluctant to leave the bubble of safety his presence provided. "Would you like to come up for coffee?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "As a thank you." Dashiell turned to look at her fully then, and something passed. Between them, a recognition perhaps of possibilities yet to unfold. But he shook his head gently. "It's too late tonight," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But how about next weekend?" The smile that bloomed across Winslade's face could have outshone the stars. "Don't forget to come." "I won't," he promised, and something in his tone told her he meant it. As she walked up to her apartment, his jacket still wrapped around her shoulders, Winslade felt as though she was floating. She knew, with the kind of certainty that comes rarely in life, that everything had changed. This wasn't just a chance encounter or a heroic rescue. It was the beginning of something extraordinary. Inside her apartment, she stood by the window and watched as the Acura pulled away from the curb, its taillights disappearing into the night like dying stars. The jacket still carried his scent, and as she hugged it closer, she smiled to herself. Tomorrow she would return it to him, and perhaps that would be the beginning of their story. Little did she know, as she stood there dreaming of possibilities, that this night would become both the beginning and the benchmark of her life's greatest love story. The tale of Winslet Edinburgh and Dashiell Merrick was about to unfold, written in the ink of destiny and bound by the threads of fate, starting with a chance encounter on a cold December night in 1990. The memory of his grey eyes would stay with her long after she fell asleep that night, and in her dreams she danced to the echo of that promise. Next weekend. 2 simple words that would change everything. Chapter 2. Falling spring burst forth over the city like an artist's palette spilling across a canvas, painting the grey winter streets with splashes of vibrant colour. Cherry blossoms dusted the sidewalks with delicate pink petals, and the air carried the sweet promise of new beginnings. For Winslet Edinburgh, the changing season mirrored the transformation in her own life, as what began with a simple coffee date blossomed into something far more profound. The cafe where they first met properly sat on a quiet corner in the West Village, its facade draped in climbing ivy and its windows gleaming in the morning sun. Winslade had arrived early, her heart fluttering with anticipation as she smoothed down her pale blue sundress for the 100th time. She'd spent hours choosing the perfect outfit, something that suggested casual elegance without trying too hard. Her dark hair was swept into a loose braid, a few artfully escaped tendrils framing her face. When Dashiell walked in, the entire cafe seemed to hold its breath. He wore a light grey suit that complemented his eyes, the jacket hanging casually over his arm in deference to the warming spring air. Their eyes met across the room, and Winslade felt that same spark of electricity she'd experienced on the night he'd rescued her. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting," he said, sliding into the chair across from her. His smile held a warmth that belied his powerful presence, and Winslade found herself relaxing despite her nerves. "Not at all," she replied, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened when his fingers accidentally brushed hers as he reached for the menu. "I just arrived myself." That first coffee stretched into hours of conversation that flowed as naturally as the spring breeze. They discovered shared passions for art and music, debated their favorite books, and laughed over childhood stories. Winslate was surprised to learn that despite his wealth and success, Dashiell had come from humble beginnings, working his way through college and building his empire from scratch. "My father was a carpenter," he told her, his grey eyes distant with memory. "He taught me that true wealth isn't about money, it's about creating something meaningful, something that lasts." Winslate found herself captivated not just by his words, but by the subtle expressions that crossed his face as he spoke. The slight furrow of his brow when he was deep in thought, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the gentle cadence of his voice as he asked about her dreams and aspirations. "I want to open my own art gallery someday," she confided, surprised by how easily the words came. It was a dream she rarely shared, fearing others would dismiss it as naive or impractical. Something intimate and unique, showcasing emerging artists who deserve to be discovered. Instead of the polite dismissal she half expected, Dashiell leaned forward, genuinely intrigued. "Tell me more," he encouraged, and for the next hour they lost themselves in discussing potential locations, artistic themes, and innovative exhibition concepts. That first date set the tone for the months that followed. Their coffee meetings evolved into elegant dinners at hidden gem restaurants Dashiell somehow always knew about, long walks through the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he listened intently to her passionate observations about various pieces, and weekend drives in his Acura NSX to discover small towns and antique shops along the coast. What struck Winslate most was how Dashiell's wealth never created a barrier between them. He could have impressed her with extravagant gifts and grand gestures, but instead he won her heart with his thoughtfulness and genuine interest in her world. He remembered how she took her coffee, one sugar, splash of cream, brought her favorite flowers, purple irises, not roses, and kept a sketchbook in his car because he knew she loved to draw when inspiration struck. Spring melted into summer, and their love deepened with each passing day. They spent lazy Sunday afternoons in Central Park, Winslate's head resting in Dashiell's lap as he read poetry to her from worn volumes he'd collected over the years. She discovered his secret passion for photography, the way he captured moments of quiet beauty that others might miss, raindrops on spider webs, the play of light through leaves, the subtle expressions that crossed her face when she was lost in thought. Their first kiss happened on a warm June evening in his garden, surrounded by the heady scent of blooming jasmine. Dashiell had invited her to dinner at his home, a stunning brownstone that somehow managed to feel both impressive and welcoming. He'd cooked for her, a simple but perfect pasta dish that spoke of hidden talents. As they walked through the garden after dinner, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Winslate found herself studying his profile. The strong line of his jaw, the subtle curve of his lips, the way the fading light caught the silver threads in his grey eyes. When he turned to catch her looking, the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. "Winslate," he said softly, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, and she found herself leaning into it instinctively. The kiss, when it came, felt like coming home. His lips were soft against hers, one hand cradling her face while the other drew her closer. Time seemed to stop, the world narrowing to this perfect moment. The warmth of his embrace, the beating of their hearts in sync, the gentle sigh that escaped her as they finally parted. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she whispered against his lips, the words slipping out before she could stop them. For a moment, fear gripped her. It was too soon, too much, too honest. But Dashiell's smile could have lit up the darkening garden. I think I fell in love with you the moment I saw you, he confessed, pulling her close again. I just needed time to accept that something so perfect could be real. As summer progressed, their relationship deepened in ways that surprised them both. They discovered the joy of quiet moments, making breakfast together on lazy Sunday mornings, Dashiell teaching her to play chess in his study while rain tapped against the windows, Winslet showing him how to mix colors for painting as the afternoon light streamed through her small apartment's windows. Their differences, rather than dividing them, seemed to complement each other perfectly. Dashiell's practical nature balanced Winslet's artistic spontaneity. Her enthusiasm for life's simple pleasures helped him remember there was more to existence than board meetings and business deals. He taught her about wine and classical music. She introduced him to street art and indie bands. Together, they created a world that was entirely their own. It was during one of their weekend getaways to a small coastal town that Winslet first realized she couldn't imagine her life without him. They were walking along the beach at sunset, the waves lapping gently at their bare feet. Dashiell had been unusually quiet, lost in thought as they watched the sun sink into the horizon. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, squeezing his hand gently. He turned to look at her, and the love in his eyes took her breath away. "I was thinking about how complete my life feels with you in it," he said simply. "How everything before you seems like a prelude to this, to us." In that moment, standing on the beach with sand between her toes and salt spray in her hair, Winslet knew with unshakable certainty that this was it. This was the love stories were written about, the kind that changed lives and moved mountains. The decision to propose came to her naturally, as inevitable as the tide coming in. She spent weeks planning the perfect moment, wanting it to be as special as the man who had captured her heart. The garden where they'd shared their first kiss seemed the perfect setting. Their own private Eden, where their love had first bloomed. On a moonlit evening, 6 months after their first meeting, surrounded by the roses Dashiell had planted because they reminded him of her, Winslet gathered her courage. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure he must hear it, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I know I'm young," she began, taking both his hands in hers, "but I've never felt this way about anyone. Every day with you feels like a gift, every moment a treasure I want to hold on to forever." She took a deep breath, looking up into those storm-grey eyes that had become her home. "Will you marry me?" The world seemed to hold its breath in that eternal moment before Dashiell pulled her into his arms, his own eyes glistening with tears of joy. "Yes, Winslet," he whispered against her hair. "You've brought meaning to my life. I can't imagine a future without you." They stood there in the moonlit garden, holding each other as if they never wanted to let go. While somewhere in the distance a nightingale began to sing, neither of them could have known that this perfect moment was just the eye of a storm that would test their love to its very limits. But in that moment, nothing existed except their joy, their love, and the promise of a future together. As spring had heralded their beginning, summer had nurtured their growth, and autumn would witness their commitment. Neither of them suspected that winter would bring a frost that threatened to kill the delicate flower of their love before it had truly bloomed. But that was still to come. For now, they were simply two souls who had found their other half, standing in a garden that had become sacred ground, dreaming of the life they would build together. Chapter 3. A Dream. Wedding. Dawn broke over the castle like a painter's masterpiece, streaks of rose gold and lavender stretching across the autumn sky. The ancient stone walls seemed to glow from within, as if the very building itself was aware of the momentous occasion it would host. Dewdrops sparkled on perfectly manicured lawns, and a gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of late-blooming roses through the morning air. Inside the bridal suite, Winslet Edinburgh stood before a floor-length mirror, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. The custom-designed wedding gown she wore was a testament to both artistry and elegance. Yards of imported silk and handmade lace flowing like liquid moonlight around her figure. The bodice was intricately embroidered with tiny pearls and crystals that caught the light with every movement, creating the illusion that she was wrapped in starlight. "You look like something out of a fairy tale," her mother whispered, tears glistening in her eyes as she adjusted the cathedral-length veil. The delicate lace had been handmade in Venice, its intricate patterns telling stories of love and devotion in thread and skill. Winslade touched the pearl necklace at her throat, a gift from Dashiell that had arrived that morning with a note that made her heart flutter. "For the woman who gave my life meaning. Until forever, D double quote." The pearls had belonged to his grandmother, passed down through generations with a history of lasting love behind them. In another wing of the castle, Dashiell Merrick stood at a window overlooking the grounds, his athletic frame cut perfectly by a bespoke tuxedo that spoke of understated elegance. His best man, Marcus, watched him with amusement. "Nervous?" Marcus asked, straightening his own bow tie. Dashiell's reflection smiled in the window. "Not nervous," he replied, his voice steady. "Just impatient. It feels like I've been waiting my whole life for this day." The castle's grand ballroom had been transformed into a scene from a romantic dream. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across marble floors, their light multiplied by thousands of carefully placed mirrors. Fresh flowers cascaded from elaborate arrangements, their colors chosen to complement the autumn season. Deep burgundies, rich golds, and subtle ivories, creating a warm, intimate atmosphere despite the room's grand scale. 1,000 candles waited to be lit, their presence promising to add a magical glow to the evening celebration. The air was thick with the scent of roses, lilies, and the subtle hint of sandalwood from hidden censers placed strategically throughout the space. But in the midst of this fairy tale setting, dark eyes watched from the shadows. Marigold Devon stood in a doorway, her burgundy bridesmaid dress a perfect fit for her statuesque figure. She had known Dashiell for 10 years, had been there through his rise to success, had waited patiently for him to notice her as more than a friend. Now she watched, as another woman prepared to claim what she had always believed should be hers. Her fingers tightened around her champagne glass as she observed the final preparations. The wedding planner rushed past, giving last-minute instructions to a team of florists. Musicians began to set up in the corner, their instruments gleaming in the morning light. Everything was perfect, too perfect. "You're here early," a voice said behind her. Marigold turned to find Marcus studying her with knowing eyes. "Just wanted to help with any last-minute details," she replied smoothly, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's not every day your best friend gets married." Marcus held her gaze a moment too long, as if he could see the thoughts churning behind her carefully composed expression. "No," he said finally, "it's not." As the morning progressed, guests began to arrive, a who's who of New York society mixed with close friends and family. Women in designer dresses and men in perfectly tailored suits filled the castle's great hall, their excited chatter echoing off ancient stones. In the bridal suite, Winslade's hands trembled slightly as her mother fastened the last pearl button on her dress. The gravity of the moment seemed to press in around her. In just hours, she would be Mrs. Merrick, united forever with the man who had captured her heart on that fateful December night. "Something borrowed," her mother said softly, pinning a vintage sapphire brooch to the inside of her dress, near her heart. "It belonged to your grandmother." "Something blue," her sister added, slipping a delicate garter trimmed with blue ribbon around her leg. "Something old," her father's voice came from the doorway. He held a small box containing a pair of antique diamond earrings that caught the light like captured stars. "And something new." her best friend Sarah finished, presenting her with a delicate ankle bracelet of platinum and diamonds, a gift from the bridesmaids. A knock at the door announced the arrival of the photographer, ready to capture these precious moments. Winslet posed with her family, her heart so full of joy she thought it might burst. Yet even in these moments of pure happiness, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her with less than celebratory thoughts. Marigold moved through the pre-wedding preparations like a shadow, her smile fixed and bright, while her mind worked furiously. She had watched Dashiell build his empire from nothing, had been there through the late nights and early mornings, had supported him when others doubted his vision, and now this girl, this child barely out of high school, would reap the rewards of his success. The wedding planner's voice cut through her bitter thoughts, announcing that it was time to take their places. Guests began filing into the ceremony space, where thousands of white roses created an enchanted garden atmosphere. The string quartet began to play softly, their music weaving through the air like golden thread. Dashiell stood at the altar, his grey eyes fixed on the grand doors through which his bride would soon appear. The autumn sunlight streaming through stained glass windows created a halo effect around him, as if nature itself was blessing this union. The bridesmaids began their procession, each carrying a bouquet of deep burgundy roses tied with gold ribbon. Marigold took her place among them, her face a mask of perfect joy, even as her heart burned with resentment. From her position, she had a clear view of Dashiell's face. The love and anticipation written there made her stomach turn. Then the music changed, and a collective gasp rose from the assembled guests as Winslet appeared in the doorway on her father's arm. She seemed to float down the aisle, her gown catching the light in ways that made her appear almost ethereal. But it was her face that captured everyone's attention. The pure joy and love radiating from her expression transformed her natural beauty into something transcendent. Dashiell's breath caught in his throat at the sight of her. Later, he would remember this moment as the time his heart stopped and started again, realigning itself to beat in time with hers. When she reached him and placed her hand in his, the world seemed to fall away until there was nothing left but the two of them. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his voice rich with emotion, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found in each other their perfect match." The ceremony proceeded like a dream, each word and gesture infused with deep meaning. When they exchanged rings, his a simple platinum band, hers a delicate creation of diamonds and platinum that complemented her engagement ring, their hands trembled with the weight of the moment. "I, Dashiell James Merrick, take you, Winslet Rose Edinburgh, to be my lawfully wedded wife," his voice carried clearly through the hushed room. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." Winslet's voice shook slightly as she repeated the vows, tears of joy spilling onto her cheeks. "I, Winslet Rose Edinburgh, take you, Dashiell James Merrick, to be my lawfully wedded husband." From her place among the bridesmaids, Marigold watched with growing bitterness. Each word of love and devotion was like a knife in her heart. Each smile exchanged between the couple, a reminder of what she had lost, or rather, what she had never had the chance to gain. "By the power vested in me," the priest's voice rose with joy, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." The kiss they shared was both tender and passionate, a perfect balance of public propriety and private devotion. The assembled guests burst into applause, but neither Winslet nor Dashiell seemed to notice. They were lost in their own world, where only their love existed. As rose petals showered down from hidden balconies, the newly married couple made their way back down the aisle. Winslet's laugh of pure joy echoed off the stone walls, and Dashiell looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. The reception that followed was a celebration that would be talked about for years to come. The 1,000 candles were lit as dusk fell, their flames reflected infinitely in the strategic mirrors until it seemed the entire room was filled with starlight. The orchestra played as couples swirled across the dance floor, their movements creating living art against the backdrop of flowers and light. Dashiell and Winslate's first dance was to a classical piece he had chosen, Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet Overture, performed by a full orchestra. They moved together as if they'd been dancing all their lives, his strong frame supporting her graceful movements, their eyes never leaving each other's faces. "I love you," he whispered as they danced, his voice meant for her ears alone. "More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." Winslate's answer was in her eyes, in the way she pressed closer to him, in the perfect synchronization of their movements. They were no longer two separate people, but one unit, one heart beating in two bodies, one soul shared between two forms. As the evening progressed, Marigold watched from the shadows, nursing her third glass of champagne. She observed every touch, every loving glance, every moment of perfect happiness between the newlyweds. And with each observation, her resolve strengthened. This wasn't right. This couldn't be allowed to continue. When Winslate threw her bouquet, it was Marigold who caught it, her smile sharp as a razor's edge as she clutched the flowers. Some of the guests cheered, seeing it as a good omen. They couldn't have known that in that moment she was already forming plans that would test the very foundations of Winslate and Dashiell's love. The celebration continued late into the night, a perfect blend of elegance and joy. When the newlyweds finally departed for their honeymoon, they left behind a room full of happy guests and one heart full of darkness. Marigold watched their car disappear into the night, her mind already working on what would come next. As the castle slowly emptied of guests, the 1,000 candles burning low in their holders, Marigold stood alone in the grand ballroom. She picked up a fallen rose petal, crushing it between her fingers until its sweet scent became a reminder of what she had lost, what had been taken from her. "Enjoy your happiness while it lasts," she whispered to the empty room, her words carried away by the autumn wind that swept through the open windows, "because nothing this perfect can last forever." The castle settled into silence as the last guests departed, the flowers beginning to droop, the candles flickering out, one by one. But in that silence, something dark had taken root, a seed of jealousy and revenge that would grow to threaten the very happiness it envied. Miles away, Winslate and Dashiell began their new life together, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering on their horizon. Their love, so pure and strong in this moment, would soon be tested in ways they could never have imagined. But for now, they had their perfect day, their perfect love, their perfect beginning. And in the shadows, Marigold waited, her patience born of years of watching and wanting. She would have her chance. All she needed was the right moment, the right circumstance, the right vulnerability to exploit. After all, she had learned from watching Dashiell's business dealings that timing was everything. The wedding day had ended, but the real story was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Setup. The December storm raged across Manhattan like nature's fury unleashed, sheets of rain turning the city lights into watercolor blurs. In her luxurious penthouse apartment, Marigold Devon watched lightning split the sky, each flash illuminating her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her honey-blonde hair was perfectly styled, despite the humidity, her emerald silk blouse and tailored black pants suggesting casual elegance. But her eyes held something darker, a storm to match the one outside. "Everything is in place," James Conrad said from his position in one of her Italian leather armchairs. The private investigator's gravelly voice carried over the thunder, his weathered face reflected in the window beside her own. The photographer, Anton, is the best in the business for this kind of delicate work. He'll capture exactly what you want people to see, regardless of what's actually happening. Marigold's red lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And his discretion is guaranteed. For what you're paying him. Conrad chuckled darkly. He'd take these secrets to his grave. She turned from the window, moving to her extensive bar cart with the grace of a jungle cat. The crystal decanter caught the lightning's glow as she poured 2 fingers of Dashiell's favorite scotch, Macallan 25, the same brand she'd watched him order at countless business dinners over the years. She'd learned his preferences meticulously, shaped herself to be his perfect match in every way. 10 years, she said softly, swirling the amber liquid. 10 years I've been by his side. Through the startups, the failures, the successes. I was there when he made his first million, when he lost everything in the tech crash, when he built it all back up again. I knew exactly what he needed, exactly who he needed me to be. Her free hand traced along the wall of photographs, documenting her history with Dashiell. Class photos from business school, charity galas, vacation snapshots. A careful curation of moments suggesting intimacy that had never quite existed. Her fingers lingered on an image from 5 years ago, Dashiell with his arm around her waist at a New Year's Eve party, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. Then this child appears, she continued, her voice hardening. This naive little art gallery intern with her dreams and her youth and her complete ignorance of his world. And suddenly, everything I've worked for, everything I've built, becomes worthless. Conrad watched her carefully, noting the way her hand tightened around the crystal tumbler. You're sure this is how you want to handle it? Once these photos exist? Oh yes. Marigold's laugh was sharp as broken glass. I'm going to prove what I've always known. Their perfect love story is nothing but a fantasy. Real love, lasting love, is built on years of understanding, of knowing someone's depths, not some fairy tale rescue at a concert hall. She moved to her bedroom, where a white silk nightgown lay carefully arranged on her king-sized bed. The fabric was expensive, chosen specifically to photograph well, suggesting both vulnerability and seduction. Every detail had been planned. The lighting adjusted to create suggestive shadows, the angles of her furniture considered for optimal photography, even the storm itself waited for as the perfect backdrop. Across the street, Anton was already setting up his equipment in an empty office space rented for precisely this purpose. His camera lens would have a perfect view of her bedroom and living room, ready to capture what would appear to be an intimate encounter. The beauty of it, Marigold said, returning to the living room, is that Dashiell's very nature will be his undoing. His need to play the hero, to rescue damsels in distress. It makes him so very predictable. As if on cue, thunder cracked violently overhead. Marigold checked her watch, an elegant Cartier piece Dashiell had complimented once at a charity auction. It's time. Conrad stood, tucking an envelope thick with cash into his jacket. Remember, you never met me. This conversation never happened. If anything goes wrong, nothing will go wrong. Marigold cut him off, her confidence absolute. I've waited too long, planned too carefully for any mistakes. After the investigator left, Marigold began her final preparations. She changed into the nightgown, its silk fabric clinging to her curves in ways that would photograph beautifully. Her makeup was carefully adjusted to suggest distress while remaining attractive, her hair artfully tousled to imply vulnerability. At precisely 11 o'clock, she picked up her phone. Her hands were steady as she dialed Dashiell's number. This moment, like everything else, had been rehearsed countless times in her mind. 3 rings, then his voice. Marigold, is everything all right? She let a perfectly calibrated sob escape. Please, Dashiell. I think someone's trying to break in. I keep hearing noises and the storm. I'm scared. Please, can you come?" The pause that followed was exactly what she'd expected. Dashiell weighing his obligations to his new wife against his ingrained need to help an old friend. "Have you called the police?" he asked, concern evident in his tone. I tried," she stammered, adding just the right amount of hysteria to her voice. "They said they're backed up because of the storm. Please, you're the only one I trust. I don't know what to do." Another crack of thunder punctuated her words perfectly. She heard him sigh, could picture him running a hand through his dark hair as he made his decision. "Text me if anything changes. I'll be there as soon as I can." In the apartment across the street, Anton adjusted his camera settings, prepared for the scene about to unfold. The rain-streaked windows would add an artistic element to the photos, creating a noir-like atmosphere, perfect for suggesting illicit romance. Marigold positioned herself carefully on the floor, arranging the nightgown to ride up just enough to be suggestive without being obvious. The lighting she'd staged cast dramatic shadows across her body, creating an image that would seem intimate, even in its apparent innocence. 15 minutes later, she heard his key in the lock. The emergency key she'd insisted he keep years ago, another piece in her long game. "Marigold?" Dashiell's voice called out, heavy with concern. "In here," she responded weakly, adding a tremor to her voice. He appeared in the doorway, rain darkening his suit, hair slightly disheveled from the storm. For a moment, seeing him like this, the man she'd wanted for so long, Marigold felt her mask slip. But she quickly recovered, remembering her role. Dashiell rushed to her side exactly as she'd predicted, his protective instincts overriding any potential suspicion. The camera across the street captured every moment as he lifted her from the floor, cradling her with the gentle strength she'd always admired. "Are you hurt?" he asked, carrying her to the bedroom. In the photographs, it would look like lovers disappearing into an intimate space, all context lost. "Just shaken," she murmured, clinging to him slightly longer than necessary as he placed her on the bed. "Thank you for coming. I don't know what I would have done." Dashiell stepped back, maintaining a professional distance that made her blood boil. Even now, even here, his loyalty to Winslet was evident in every careful movement. "Have you checked all the windows? Doors?" "I think so," she said, letting vulnerability color her voice. "Would you mind checking? I'm still so frightened." As he moved through the apartment, checking security points, Marigold allowed herself a moment of triumph. The photos would be perfect. A married man entering her apartment late at night, carrying her to bed in a revealing nightgown. Context wouldn't matter. Suspicion would do its work. "Everything's secure," Dashiell reported, returning to the bedroom doorway but not entering. "Do you want me to call someone to stay with you?" Marigold shook her head, playing her part to perfection. "No, I feel safer now. Thank you for coming, Dash. You've always been there when I needed you." Something in her tone made him pause, studying her face. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of suspicion cross his features, but it passed quickly. "Try to get some rest," he said simply, then turned to leave. After the front door clicked shut, Marigold moved to her window, watching his car pull away through the rain. She picked up her phone, dialing Conrad's number. "Is it done?" "Anton got everything we needed," he confirmed. "The angles, the lighting, it all looks exactly like what you wanted it to look like. He'll have the prints ready tomorrow." "Perfect," she purred, raising her glass in a toast to her reflection. "Make sure they're delivered to the right person at the right time." The next day dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had never happened. Marigold sat at her vanity, carefully applying her makeup while she waited for the inevitable. The manila envelope containing the photographs had been delivered to Winslate's office an hour ago, each image carefully selected and arranged to tell a devastating story. Her phone rang, Dashiell's number flashing on the screen. She let it ring twice before answering, her voice carefully neutral. "Hello? What did you do?" His voice was cold with fury, and she could picture him standing in his office, one hand clenched into a fist on his desk. "I proved a point, darling," she replied, satisfaction evident in every word. "Did your child bride finally show her true colors? Did she trust you enough to ask for an explanation? Or did she just run away?" "If you were the last woman on earth, I'd still never marry you," he spat, each word dripping with disgust. "You've ruined everything." "No, Dashiell," she corrected him gently. "You ruined everything when you chose her over me. I've loved you for 10 years. How could you pick that girl over everything we could have been? She didn't trust you, and I proved it with a little prank. Forget the past and start a new life with me." The silence that followed was deafening. When Dashiell spoke again, his voice was different, harder, colder than she'd ever heard it. "You're insane," he said quietly. "Stay away from me, and stay away from my wife." The line went dead, and Marigold stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her wasn't the polished socialite she usually presented to the world. This was someone else, someone with victory in her eyes and vengeance in her smile. She raised her glass in a mock toast. "To true love," she murmured, her lips curving into a satisfied smirk. The game was set, the pieces were in motion, and she had finally made her move. Outside her window, the city had begun to dry from the previous night's storm, the sun turning puddles into mirrors, reflecting a bright blue sky. Somewhere, Winslate was probably crying, her young heart broken by what she believed was betrayal. Somewhere, Dashiell was probably trying desperately to explain, to fix what had been so carefully broken. But here, in her apartment with its wall of photographs and memories, Marigold savoured her victory. She had waited 10 years for this moment, had planned and plotted and positioned herself perfectly. The fact that it had been so easy, that one night and a few photographs could destroy what they claimed was true love, only proved she had been right all along. Their fairy tale was over, and she had written the ending. Now, in the calm after the storm, she would wait to see what rose from the ashes of their shattered dream. And perhaps, in the ruins of their happiness, she would finally find her own. Chapter 5. The Shattering. The manila envelope sat on Winslate's desk like a ticking bomb. No return address, no markings, just her name written in elegant cursive across the front. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, an inexplicable sense of dread settling in her stomach. The weight of it felt wrong, as if it contained more than just paper, as if it held the power to destroy worlds. Outside her office window at the art gallery, the day was drawing to a close. Golden autumn sunlight slanted through the glass, casting long shadows across her desk. She had been organizing the upcoming exhibition of emerging artists, her dream project that Dashiell had helped make possible. Everything in her life seemed perfect, too perfect perhaps. The sound of the envelope tearing seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet space. As she pulled out the contents, her world began to tilt on its axis. The first photograph slipped from nerveless fingers, landing face up on her desk, Dashiell entering Marigold's apartment building late at night. Her heart began to race, but she forced herself to look at the next image. Dashiell carrying Marigold, her white silk nightgown riding high on her thighs, his hands on her body. The intimate lighting, the way they disappeared into the bedroom. Each photograph told a story that made Winslate's stomach turn, but it was the timestamp on the images that drove the final nail into her heart. Last night, during the storm. "No," she whispered, the word escaping like a prayer. "No, no, no." Her mind flashed back to the previous night. Dashiell had received a phone call late in the evening, his expression concerned as he listened. "It's Marigold," he'd said. "She thinks someone's trying to break in. I should check on her." Winslet had trusted him completely. Why wouldn't she? He was her husband, her soulmate, the man who had rescued her that night at the concert and had been her hero ever since. She had kissed him goodbye, told him to be careful in the storm, and waited up for his return. When he came home, he'd seemed normal, perhaps a bit distracted, but he'd explained that Marigold had been frightened by the storm and some strange noises. He'd checked her apartment and assured her everything was secure. Winslet had believed him without question. Now, looking at the photographs spread across her desk like evidence at a crime scene, that trust felt like ashes in her mouth. Every touch, every kiss, every moment they'd shared seemed tainted by this betrayal. How long had it been going on? How many other late-night visits had there been? Her phone buzzed, a text from Dashiell. "Looking forward to dinner tonight. Love you." The casual affection in those words, sent by the same hands that had held another woman just hours before, made something snap inside her. The drive home passed in a blur of tears and rage. The perfect life she'd built, the fairy tale romance she'd thought would last forever, it was all crumbling around her. The photographs burned in her purse like hot coals, each one a testament to her husband's infidelity. Their home, their beautiful, love-filled home, seemed to mock her as she pulled into the driveway. Every corner held memories. Their first breakfast together in the kitchen, lazy Sunday afternoons reading in the library, quiet moments in the garden where she had proposed. How many of those moments had been real? How many had been lies? She found him in his study, reading through some business documents. He looked up with a smile that died on his lips when he saw her face. Winslet. He rose from his desk, concern etched on his features. "What's wrong?" The sound of his voice, that voice that had whispered love and promises, ignited her fury. She pulled the photographs from her purse, throwing them onto his desk where they scattered like fallen leaves. "What's wrong?" she repeated, her voice rising with each word. "What's wrong is that my husband is a cheater. What's wrong is that every word, every touch, every moment we've shared has been a lie." Dashiell's face went pale as he looked at the photographs. "Winslet, this isn't what it looks like." "Let me explain." "Explain?" She laughed, the sound harsh and broken. "Explain how you spent last night in Marigold's bedroom. Explain how you could betray our marriage, our love, everything we built together." He reached for her, but she jerked away as if his touch would burn. "Don't," she spat. "Don't you dare touch me with the same hands that held her. Please, just listen." He started, but Winslet was beyond listening. The pain in her chest had transformed into a rage that demanded release. "Dashiell Merrick, you're a cheater!" Her voice echoed through their home, raw with pain and betrayal. "I don't want to see you again in my life. You've destroyed our marriage. I never expected this from you. I loved you more than anyone in the world." Tears streamed down her face as she pulled her wedding ring from her finger. The diamond caught the light, sending prisms dancing across the walls. One last moment of beauty before everything shattered. She placed it on his desk with trembling fingers. "Winslet, please!" Dashiell's voice cracked with desperation. "You have to let me explain. This isn't what you think. Marigold, don't say her name." Winslet cut him off. "Don't you dare try to explain away what I can see with my own eyes. Was she worth it? Was destroying everything we had worth one night with her?" She turned away, unable to bear the sight of him any longer. Her feet carried her through their home, past the photos of their wedding, past the art pieces they'd chosen together, past all the evidence of a life built on what she now knew was a foundation of lies. At the door, she paused. "I trusted you completely," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I believed in you. in us, in everything we were supposed to be. But you couldn't even wait 4 months after our wedding before betraying that trust. It's not like that, Dashiell pleaded, following her. You don't understand what really happened. Please, just give me a chance to explain. But Winslate was done listening. The pain in her chest had become a physical thing, crushing her heart with each breath. She grabbed her car keys and her purse, leaving everything else behind. I understand perfectly, she said, her hand on the doorknob. I understand that I was a fool to think someone like you could truly love someone like me. I understand that while I was building dreams of our future, you were sneaking into another woman's bedroom. I understand that everything I believed about us was a lie. She pulled the door open, the cool evening air rushing in to fill the space between them. Goodbye, Dashiell. I hope she was worth losing everything for. The door slammed behind her with a finality that echoed through the empty house. She ran to her car, tears blinding her as she fumbled with the keys. Behind her, she could hear Dashiell calling her name, but she refused to look back. As she drove away from their perfect home, from their perfect life, from everything she had thought was real, the sky opened up and began to rain, as if nature itself was weeping for her shattered dreams. She drove without direction, without purpose, just needing to put distance between herself and the ruins of her happiness. Hours later, she found herself in a small hotel on the outskirts of the city. The room was nothing like the luxury she had become accustomed to, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror across the room. The woman who looked back at her was a stranger, eyes red from crying, makeup smeared, hair disheveled. Where was the confident, happy bride who had danced at her wedding just 4 months ago? Where was the woman who had believed in fairy tales and happy endings? Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls and messages from Dashiell, but she couldn't bear to look at them. Each notification was just another reminder of his betrayal, another crack in her already broken heart. As the night wore on, she sat in the darkness of the hotel room, replaying every moment of their relationship in her mind. Had there been signs she'd missed? Had Marigold's smiles held hidden meanings? Had Dashiell's late nights at the office really been spent at the office at all? The pain came in waves, each one threatening to drown her. One moment she was numb, the next she was gasping for air through her tears. The young girl who had fallen in love with her rescuer at the concert hall seemed like a naive fool now, believing in knights in shining armor and true love. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Winslate had made her decision. She would disappear, start fresh somewhere new, somewhere far from the memories of Dashiell Merrick and his betrayal. She would rebuild herself from the ashes of her broken dreams. She checked out of the hotel and drove to a small apartment complex she'd once considered renting before Dashiell came into her life. The landlord remembered her, and seeing her distress, offered her a month-to-month lease without questions. As she signed the rental agreement with shaking hands, she realized that this was her new reality. No more fairy tale castle, no more perfect love story, no more happily ever after, just a broken heart and the long, lonely road of starting over. The sun was setting when she finally allowed herself to cry again, truly cry, in the empty space of her new apartment. The sound of her sobs echoed off bare walls, a symphony of pain and lost love. Outside, life went on. Cars passed, people walked by, the world continued turning. But for Winslate Edinburgh, everything had stopped the moment she opened that manila envelope. In the growing darkness, she made a promise to herself. She would never trust so completely again, never give her heart so freely, never believe in fairy tales. The lesson had been too painful, the cost too high. Somewhere across the city, in their beautiful home, Dashiell was probably still trying to call her, still trying to explain. But some things, once broken, can never be fixed. Some betrayals cut too deep for explanations or apologies. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of rebuilding her life. But tonight, she allowed herself to mourn for the love she had lost, for the dreams that had died, and for the innocent young woman who had believed in forever. Chapter 6. The Truth Revealed. Dashiell Merrick stood in his empty home, surrounded by the echoes of Winslet's final words. The photographs lay scattered across his desk, like evidence of a crime he hadn't committed. Each image, a carefully crafted lie that had destroyed everything he held dear. Rain began to fall again outside, a gentle patter against the windows that seemed to mock the storm raging in his heart. His hands shook as he picked up one of the photographs. The camera had captured exactly what Marigold had wanted it to: angles and shadows, creating an illusion of intimacy that couldn't have been further from the truth. In his mind, he replayed the previous night's events, seeing now how perfectly he'd been manipulated. "Damn you, Marigold," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Without warning, his fist connected with the solid oak desk, pain shooting through his hand. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the agony of watching Winslet walk away, of seeing the trust die in her eyes. He reached for his phone, dialing her number for what felt like the 100th time. Each unanswered ring was like a knife to his heart. "Please," he whispered as her voicemail picked up again. "Please, just let me explain." The sound of tires on wet pavement drew him to the window, hope flaring briefly in his chest, but it was just a passing car. Their neighbor walking her dog glanced up at him with poorly concealed curiosity. No doubt the entire street had heard Winslet's accusations. The thought of their private pain becoming public gossip made his jaw clench. He couldn't stay here, couldn't stand in this house full of memories while his world crumbled around him. Grabbing his keys, he headed for his car with single-minded purpose. He knew where he needed to go first. The drive to Marigold's penthouse passed in a blur of rain-slicked streets and red lights that seemed to mock his urgency. Her building loomed ahead, its elegant architecture now seeming as false as its resident. The doorman recognized him, started to offer a greeting, but Dashiell strode past without acknowledgement. In the elevator, he caught his reflection in the polished brass walls. His hair disheveled from running his hands through it, his tie loosened, his eyes holding a dangerous edge he barely recognized. The man who stared back at him looked capable of violence. Marigold opened her door with a smile that made his blood boil. She wore a silk robe in deep emerald, her hair perfectly styled, looking for all the world like she hadn't just destroyed his marriage. "Dashiell," she purred, leaning against the doorframe. "I was wondering when you'd—" "What did you do?" His voice cut through her greeting like a blade, low and deadly. He pushed past her into the apartment, noticing how the space was perfectly arranged, as if she'd been waiting for this confrontation. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, but her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Has something happened?" Dashiell spun to face her, his control hanging by a thread. "Drop the act, Marigold. The photographs. The setup. Was this your plan all along? To destroy my marriage?" She moved to her bar cart, pouring herself a drink with steady hands. "I merely showed your child bride the truth she refused to see, that there are some connections that can't be broken by a few months of infatuation." "Infatuation?" Dashiell laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. "Is that what you think my marriage is? My love for Winslet? Oh, please." Marigold's composure cracked slightly, her voice taking on an edge. "I've been by your side for 10 years, Dashiell. I know you better than that little girl ever could. I was there when you built your empire, when you needed someone who understood your world." "You were my friend," he said, emphasizing the past tense. "Someone I trusted. And you used that trust to orchestrate this twisted manipulation." Marigold's laugh was soft and cruel. "I've loved you for 10 years. How could you choose her over me? She didn't trust you, and I proved it with a little prank. Forget the past and start a new life with me." The words hung in the air between them, revealing the depth of her delusion. Dashiell stared at her, really seeing her for the first time, not as the polished socialite who'd been his friend and confidant, but as someone whose obsession had twisted their entire relationship into something dark and poisonous. "If you were the last woman on earth," he said quietly, each word precise and cutting, "I'd still never marry you. You've ruined everything." Her face hardened, the mask of sophistication slipping to reveal something ugly beneath. "I ruined nothing. Your precious Winslet did that herself by running away without even asking for an explanation. What kind of love is that?" "The kind that you manipulated and betrayed," he shot back. "The kind you couldn't understand if you lived 1,000 years, because real love isn't about ownership or control. It's about trust and respect. Things you clearly know nothing about." He turned to leave, but her words followed him like daggers. "She'll never trust you again, Dashiell. I've made sure of that, and when you finally realize what you've lost, I'll be here waiting." The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the walls. In the elevator, he leaned against the cool metal, trying to steady his breathing. The confrontation had confirmed his worst fears. Marigold's obsession ran deeper than he'd ever suspected, but he couldn't focus on that now. He had to find Winslet, had to make her understand. He started with her office at the art gallery, but her assistant informed him she hadn't come in. Her favorite cafes, the park where they used to walk, the museum where they'd spent countless hours, each location turned up empty. As evening approached, desperation began to set in. He tried her parents' house, but they hadn't heard from her. Her friends either wouldn't tell him where she was, or genuinely didn't know. It was as if she had vanished into the rain-soaked city, leaving no trace behind. Finally, running out of options, he drove to her old apartment building, the place where he'd dropped her off that first night, when everything between them was full of possibility. The elderly landlord recognized him, his eyes full of sympathy. "She was here," the man confirmed, and Dashiell's heart leaped. "Rented a unit this morning, but she moved out an hour ago, left no forwarding address." "Please," Dashiell said, his voice cracking, "I need to find her. There's been a terrible misunderstanding." The landlord shook his head. "I'm sorry, son. She made me promise not to tell anyone where she went, and a promise is a promise." Defeated, Dashiell returned to their empty home. The silence pressed in around him as he walked through rooms filled with memories, her books still on the nightstand, her favorite throw blanket still draped over the couch, her scent lingering in the air like a ghost. In their bedroom, he found one of her sketching notebooks left behind in her haste to leave. Opening it, he found page after page of drawings, moments from their life together captured in her delicate strokes. Their first coffee date, him reading in the garden, quiet moments that had seemed ordinary at the time, but now felt precious beyond measure. The last drawing was unfinished, a sketch of them dancing at their wedding, her face turned up to his with complete trust and love. The sight of it broke something inside him, and for the first time since she'd walked out, Dashiell allowed himself to cry. Hours passed as he sat there, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life, the rain outside providing a steady accompaniment to his grief. His phone lay silent, no calls, no messages, no hope of reaching her. As midnight approached, he found himself in his study, staring at the photographs that had started this nightmare. In the harsh light of his desk lamp, he could see the deliberate nature of each shot, the carefully arranged angles, the strategic lighting, the way context had been stripped away to create the worst possible interpretation. He picked up the phone one last time, dialing Winslet's number more from habit than hope. This time, he left a message, his voice raw with emotion. "I know you probably won't listen to this, but I need to say it anyway. I love you, Winslet. What you saw in those photographs, it wasn't what it seemed. Marigold set up this entire situation, hired a photographer, orchestrated everything to destroy what we have. I know asking you to trust me right now seems impossible, but please just give me a chance to explain what we have, what we built together. It's worth fighting for. I'll wait for you. However long it takes, I'll wait." The message ended, and he was left with silence once again. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean. But for Dashiell, there would be no such easy cleansing. The truth had been revealed too late, and now all he could do was hope that somehow, somewhere, Winslet would find it in her heart to listen. He walked to the window, looking out at the city lights blurred by water on the glass. Somewhere out there, the love of his life was hurting, believing herself betrayed. Somewhere out there, Marigold was probably celebrating her victory, and here he stood, caught between them, watching his perfect world crumble to dust. "I'll find you," he whispered to the night. "Whatever it takes, I'll find you and make this right." But the city kept its secrets, and Winslet remained beyond his reach, her absence leaving a void that no explanation, no truth, no amount of love could fill. At least not tonight. Not yet. Chapter 7. The lost year's time has a peculiar way of both healing and deepening wounds. In the 4 years that followed that stormy December night, seasons changed, lives diverged, and two hearts learned to beat separately again, though neither ever truly forgot the rhythm they had once shared. For Dashiell Merrick, the first year passed in a haze of work and whiskey. He threw himself into his empire with renewed vigor, as if building higher towers could somehow fill the void Winslet had left behind. Board meetings blurred into business trips, contracts were signed with mechanical precision, and his reputation for ruthless efficiency grew. But those who knew him best saw the cost. The light had gone out of his eyes, replaced by a haunted look that no amount of success could erase. His office became his sanctuary and his prison. The view from the top floor of Merrick Tower stretched across the city's skyline, and sometimes, in the quiet hours of dawn, he would stand at the window and wonder if somewhere out there, Winslet was watching the same sunrise. "You need to stop doing this to yourself," Marcus told him one evening, finding him still at his desk well past midnight. The bottle of scotch on the credenza was half empty, and photographs of Winslet were spread across his desk. Not the manipulated ones that had destroyed everything, but real ones, memories of happier times. "I had investigators search for her," Dashiell admitted, his voice rough with exhaustion. "She's gone completely off the grid. Changed her name maybe, or left the country. It's like she never existed." Marcus studied his friend with concern. The past months had aged Dashiell beyond his years, silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, lines etching themselves around his eyes. "Maybe that's for the best," he suggested gently. "Maybe it's time to let go." But letting go proved impossible. Even as life moved forward, even as his company expanded and his influence grew, Dashiell carried the weight of that night like a stone in his heart. He avoided social events where he might encounter Marigold, threw himself into charity work, and tried to find meaning in success that felt increasingly hollow. It was at one of his charitable foundation's events that he first met Talia. She was 22, fresh out of business school, and working for a non-profit that provided art education to underprivileged children. The irony of her passion for art wasn't lost on him. It seemed the universe had a cruel sense of humor. "Mr. Merrick," she approached him after his speech, her green eyes bright with intelligence and determination. "Your foundation's work is incredible, but have you considered expanding into creative education?" Something about her directness, her complete focus on the work, rather than his wealth or status, caught his attention. They ended up talking for hours about educational programs, funding strategies, and the transformative power of art. It wasn't until later that he realized he hadn't thought about his loss once during their conversation. Talia was nothing like Winslet, and perhaps that was what made her presence in his life bearable. Where Winslade had been all passion and artistic spirit, Talia was pragmatic and grounded. Her beauty was classical rather than ethereal, her approach to life methodical rather than spontaneous. She didn't try to heal his wounds or replace what he had lost. She simply offered companionship without demands. Their relationship developed slowly, built on shared projects and quiet understanding. Talia never pushed for more than he could give, never asked about the shadows that sometimes crossed his face when certain songs played or when they passed certain places in the city. She accepted him as he was, broken pieces and all. "I know you're still in love with her," she told him one evening, a year into their relationship. They were sitting in his office, reviewing proposals for a new educational initiative. "I'm not trying to compete with a ghost." Dashiell looked at her then, really looked at her. Talia met his gaze steadily, her face serene. "You deserve better than this," he said quietly. "Better than someone who can't give you their whole heart." She smiled, reaching across the desk to take his hand. "Maybe. But I choose to be here, Dashiell. Sometimes love isn't about grand passions and fairy tales. Sometimes it's just about being there, about choosing each other day after day." Meanwhile, across the city, Winslade's life had taken its own turn. After fleeing their shared home, she had reinvented herself completely. Gone was the naive young artist who believed in fairy tales. In her place emerged a woman of steel and determination. She had started at the bottom, working as a sales assistant in a small boutique. Nights were spent studying business and fashion merchandising, turning her artistic eye toward the practical world of retail. Her talent for visual design, combined with an unexpected head for business, caught the attention of the boutique's owner. "You have a gift," her mentor Eleanor told her. "You understand not just beauty, but how to make it accessible, how to build a business around it." Within 2 years, Winslade had worked her way up to assistant manager, then manager, transforming the boutique into one of the city's most sought-after destinations for unique fashion. She kept her past locked away, never speaking of the love she had lost or the betrayal that had shaped her. But sometimes, late at night in her modest apartment, she would take out her old sketchbook, the one she hadn't been able to bring herself to burn. The drawings of Dashiell remained, capturing moments of a happiness that now seemed like a dream. On these nights, she would allow herself to remember, to feel, to grieve for the girl she had been and the love she had lost. The years carved new paths for both of them, paths that seemed destined never to cross again. Dashiell's relationship with Talia deepened into something comfortable, if not passionate, while Winslade built her new life brick by brick, relationship-free and fiercely independent. Then came the autumn of 1994. Dashiell, under gentle pressure from his board and Talia's practical influence, finally agreed to consider marriage again. The business world expected its titans to project stability, and a 4-year engagement to a suitable partner made sense on paper. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked when Dashiell told him of his plans to propose. "Marriage should be about more than corporate image." Dashiell stood at his office window, watching the city lights flicker to life as dusk fell. "Talia understands me," he said quietly. "She's been there through the worst of it, never asking for more than I could give. Maybe that's what real love is, not the fairy tale, but the steady presence that helps you survive when the fairy tale ends." But even as he spoke the words, his hand went to his chest where, beneath his expensive suit, he still wore his first wedding ring on a chain, a secret weight against his heart that not even Talia knew about. Back in her world, Winslade had finally achieved a measure of peace. Her promotion to boutique manager of an upscale bridal shop seemed like the universe's final joke, surrounding her with the very symbols of the happiness she had lost. but she approached it with the same determination she had applied to everything else in her new life. "You have a gift for making brides feel beautiful," her staff would tell her. They never knew that each wedding dress she styled, each veil she adjusted, was an exercise in exorcising her own ghosts. Neither Dashiell nor Winslate knew that their carefully reconstructed lives were about to collide. The universe, it seemed, wasn't finished with their story. All it would take was one afternoon, one familiar face in an upscale boutique, and 4 years of careful healing would shatter like glass. Talia, practical as ever, had insisted on shopping at the city's most exclusive bridal boutique. "It's about the image," she explained to Dashiell. "Your first wedding was a fairy tale. This one needs to be about stability, about showing the world that Dashiell Merrick has moved forward." She couldn't have known that the boutique's manager was the very woman whose shadow had lived between them for 4 years. She couldn't have known that one step through those doors would set in motion events that would test not just her relationship with Dashiell, but her own understanding of love itself. Time, that great healer and destroyer, had brought them full circle. 4 years of separation, of growth, of trying to forget, had led them right back to where they needed to be. The lost years were ending, but the hardest part of their journey was just beginning. In their separate lives, both Dashiell and Winslate had built walls around their hearts, created new identities, found ways to exist in a world that no longer contained their shared dream. But beneath the surface, beneath the successful businessman and the accomplished boutique manager, their hearts still held the memories of what they had been. And perhaps, though neither would admit it, what they could be again. As autumn turned to winter in 1994, as Talia planned their wedding and Winslate managed her boutique, the city held its breath. Sometimes the greatest distances we travel are not measured in miles or years, but in the space between hurt and healing, between loss and redemption, between ending and beginning again. Their lost years had served their purpose, teaching them both about strength, about survival, about the different faces love can wear. Now, as their paths prepared to cross again, all those lessons would be tested, because sometimes the hardest part of loving someone isn't losing them. It's finding them again when you're both different people, when the fairy tale has ended, but the story refuses to let go. Winter was coming to Manhattan once again, bringing with it the promise of change, of endings and beginnings, of lost souls finding their way back to each other. The lost years were ending, but their true test was just beginning. Chapter 8. Fate's Reunion. December 1994 arrived in Manhattan with a crystalline clarity that seemed to sharpen every edge, every memory. The city had dressed itself in holiday splendor, twinkling lights and garlands adorning every storefront. The scent of roasted chestnuts and pine needles carried on crisp winter breezes. But inside Le Rêve Bridal Boutique, winter's chill gave way to an atmosphere of warmth and luxury. Winslate Edinburgh stood at her usual post behind the antique French desk that served as the boutique's reception area. 4 years had transformed her from a dreamy-eyed bride into a polished professional. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant chignon, her tailored black suit speaking of understated sophistication. Only her eyes, still that remarkable honey color, hinted at the artist's soul beneath the manager's exterior. The morning had been typically busy. A parade of excited brides-to-be, doting mothers, and enthusiastic bridesmaids flowing through the boutique's elegant rooms. Winslate handled each appointment with practiced grace, her artistic eye and business acumen combining to create perfect moments for her clients. If anyone noticed how she never quite smiled fully when helping brides into their gowns, they were too caught up in their own joy to mention it. "Miss Edinburgh," her assistant Sarah appeared at her elbow, practically vibrating with nervous energy. "The 2 o'clock appointment is here. Talia Reynolds and—" She hesitated, glancing at her clipboard with unusual intensity. "And," Winslet prompted, already reaching for the client file, "and Dashiell Merrick." The name hit Winslet like a physical blow, sending the file slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers. Papers scattered across the marble floor as time seemed to freeze, then restart with cruel slowness. Through the boutique's frosted glass doors, she could see two figures approaching, one tall and masculine, achingly familiar even in silhouette. "Miss Edinburgh, are you all right?" Sarah's concerned voice seemed to come from very far away. Winslet forced herself to breathe, to remember the persona she had so carefully constructed over the past 4 years. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting in her chest. "Please show them to the Platinum Suite. I'll be there momentarily." As Sarah hurried to greet the clients, Winslet retreated to her private office. Her reflection in the vintage mirror showed a face pale but composed, years of practice keeping her emotions hidden behind a professional mask. She straightened her jacket, touched up her lipstick with hands that only slightly trembled, and forced herself to count to 10. "You are not that girl anymore," she whispered to her reflection. "You are not that naive bride who believed in fairy tales. You are a successful businesswoman, and this is just another appointment." But when she stepped into the Platinum Suite, the boutique's most exclusive showing room with its crystal chandeliers and silk-draped walls, all her careful preparation crumbled. Dashiell stood by the window, his broad shoulders outlined against the winter light. 4 years had added silver to his temples, new lines around his eyes, but he was still devastatingly handsome, in a way that made her heart stutter. He turned at the sound of her heels on marble, and their eyes met for the first time in 4 years. The world seemed to stop spinning, all the air leaving the room as recognition, pain, and 1,000 unspoken words passed between them in that eternal moment. Talia, elegant in a cream cashmere sweater and pearls, was the first to break the silence. "You must be Miss Edinburgh. I'm Talia Reynolds. Thank you so much for accommodating us on such short notice." Winslet forced herself to look away from Dashiell, to focus on the beautiful young woman who now wore the engagement ring she had once thought would be hers forever. "Welcome to Le Rêve," she managed, her professional smile firmly in place. "Congratulations on your engagement." The next hour passed in a surreal blur. Winslet guided Talia through the boutique's exclusive collection, her voice steady as she discussed silhouettes and fabrics. She pretended not to notice how Dashiell's eyes followed her every movement, how he seemed to flinch slightly each time she said bride or wedding. Talia was exactly what Winslet would have expected, poised, intelligent, and quietly confident. She approached wedding dress shopping with the same practical efficiency she presumably applied to everything else in life. There were no tears of joy, no romantic sighs, just careful consideration of each option. "Perhaps Mr. Merrick would be more comfortable in our gentleman's waiting area," Winslet suggested as Talia prepared to try on the first gown. "It's traditionally considered bad luck for the groom to see the dress before the wedding." "Of course," Talia agreed with a small smile. "Darling, why don't you wait outside? This could take a while." Dashiell hesitated, his eyes meeting Winslet's again with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Actually," he said, his voice rougher than she remembered, "I need to speak with Miss Edinburgh about the payment arrangements. Would you mind if we step into her office for a moment?" Winslet wanted to refuse, to run, to hide behind the walls she'd built over 4 years of careful reconstruction. But Talia was already nodding her agreement, and there was no professional reason to decline. "This way, Mr. Merrick," she said, proud of how steady her voice remained. The walk to her office felt like the longest journey of her life. Each step echoed off the marble floors, counting down to a confrontation she'd both dreaded and dreamed of for 4 years. Once inside, she moved behind her desk, a barrier between them, however flimsy. "Stop hiding," Dashiell said without preamble, his voice a mixture of anger and longing that made her heart ache. Winslet lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with all the steel she'd forged in herself over the years. "I'm not hiding, Mr. Merrick. I'm working. This is my life now." "Your life," he repeated, a bitter laugh escaping him. "You disappeared without a trace. Do you have any idea what that did to me? What I went through trying to find you? What it did to you?" Her carefully constructed composure cracked slightly. "You destroyed everything we had. You betrayed our marriage, our love, everything we—" "I never betrayed you," he cut her off, taking a step closer to her desk. "Those photographs, it wasn't what you thought. Marigold set the whole thing up. She hired a photographer, orchestrated that entire night. But you never gave me a chance to explain." Winslet's hands gripped the edge of her desk so hard her knuckles turned white. "You expect me to believe that? After all this time, I expect you to remember who I was, who we were." His voice softened, filled with a pain that matched her own. "The man you married, the man you claimed to love. Did you really believe I could betray you like that? Did our love mean so little that you could condemn me without even asking for an explanation?" The words hit her like physical blows, each one striking at the foundations of the walls she'd built around her heart. Memories flooded back, his gentleness the night they met, his patience as their love grew, the way he had looked at her on their wedding day as if she were the only woman in the world. "It doesn't matter anymore," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're getting married, to someone who obviously trusts you completely." "Yes," he agreed, and the simple word carried more weight than any argument could have. "Talia stood by me when I was broken, when the woman I loved ran away without giving me a chance to explain, when my best friend revealed herself as a manipulative snake, when my whole world fell apart. Talia was there." Tears threatened to spill from Winslet's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "Then why are you here? Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you deserve to know the truth, even if it's too late to change anything." He moved toward the door, then paused. "On Christmas night, I'm marrying Talia, the woman who stood by me when I was broken. Don't forget to come." The invitation hit her like a slap, and she stared at him in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," he replied, his hand on the doorknob. "You ran away once without hearing the truth. This time you'll have to face it, face us, and live with the consequences of your choices." He left her there, standing behind her desk with her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Through the window, she could see snow beginning to fall. December in Manhattan again, but this time bringing not the promise of love but the bitter taste of regret. The rest of the appointment passed in a fog. Winslet went through the motions professionally, helping Talia select the perfect gown with appropriate enthusiasm. If her smile never quite reached her eyes, if her hands trembled slightly as she pinned the veil in place, no one seemed to notice. As they prepared to leave, Talia turned to her with genuine warmth. "Thank you so much, Miss Edinburgh. I can see why this boutique has such an excellent reputation." Winslet nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She watched as Dashiell helped Talia with her coat, his movements gentlemanly and attentive. They looked perfect together, the successful businessman and his elegant bride, a match that made sense in every way that her own marriage to Dashiell had seemed like a fairy tale. After they left, Winslet closed the boutique early, sending her staff home with vague explanations about inventory. In the silence of the empty shop, surrounded by wedding gowns that now seemed to mock her, she finally allowed herself to cry. The snow fell heavier outside, blurring the city lights into soft smudges of color. Somewhere out there, Dashiell and Talia were probably discussing wedding plans, moving forward with their perfect life together. And here she sat, surrounded by the trappings of other people's happiness, finally facing the possibility that 4 years ago she might have made the biggest mistake of her life. His invitation, or was it a challenge, echoed in her mind. "Don't forget to come." The words carried weight, promise, and threat all at once. Could she bear to watch him marry another woman? Could she bear not to know the truth? As night fell over Manhattan, Winslet remained at her desk, lost in memories of another December, another love, another chance at happiness. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in a blank white slate, as if the universe itself was offering a chance to start over, to rewrite the story that had gone so terribly wrong. But some stories, once broken, can never be made whole again. Some choices, once made, can never be unmade. As Winslet finally gathered her things to leave, she wondered which was worse, living with the pain of betrayal or living with the possibility that she had thrown away true love because she had been too afraid to trust, too quick to run, too unwilling to fight for what they had. The boutique's lights went dark, leaving her alone with questions that had no answers and a future that seemed more uncertain than ever before. Chapter 9. The return dawn broke over Manhattan with merciless clarity, painting the snow-covered city in shades of rose and gold. Winslet hadn't slept. How could she, when Dashiell's words kept echoing in her mind, undermining everything she'd believed for the past 4 years? She stood at her apartment window, watching early morning traffic crawl through snow-laden streets, her reflection in the glass looking as haunted as she felt. The truth, or what he claimed was the truth, had shattered the carefully constructed walls of her new life. Marigold's manipulation, the staged photographs, her own rush to judgment, each revelation was like a knife twisting in her heart. Had she really been so quick to believe the worst? Had pride and fear driven her to destroy the very thing she'd been trying to protect? Her fingers traced patterns in the condensation on the window, unconsciously drawing the outline of a castle. Their castle, where they'd been married, where they'd begun their life together, where everything had fallen apart. She hadn't been back there since that night, but suddenly she knew with absolute certainty where she needed to go. The drive took longer than she remembered, or perhaps it just felt that way with her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird. The castle rose before her, its stone walls dusted with snow, looking exactly as it had 4 years ago. Only she had changed. Security stopped her at the gate. Of course they did. This was Dashiell's home now, his and Talia's. The thought made her stomach clench. "I'm sorry, miss," the guard said politely but firmly. "This is private property." "Please," she started to say, but movement on the upper gallery caught her eye. Talia stood there, wrapped in a cashmere coat, watching the scene unfold below. Their eyes met across the distance, and something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps, or a recognition. Talia raised her hand, gesturing to the guard. "Let her in, Richard." "Ms. Edinburgh is expected." The lie slid smoothly from Talia's lips, and Winslet felt a fresh wave of guilt. This woman, who had every right to bar her from the property, was instead showing her kindness she didn't deserve. The castle's great hall seemed both familiar and foreign as Winslet walked through it. Her heels clicked against marble floors that had once been strewn with rose petals at her wedding. Crystal chandeliers that had once cast rainbow light on her white gown now illuminated her black wool coat and the snow melting in her hair. Dashiell stood in his study, their old study, staring out the window at the snow-covered gardens. He didn't turn when she entered, but his shoulders tensed, acknowledging her presence. "I didn't expect you to come here," he said quietly. "I didn't expect to be here," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The room was exactly as she remembered it, the antique desk, the wall of books, the subtle scent of leather and sandalwood. Only the photographs had changed. Where there had once been images of their life together, there were now pictures of Dashiell and Talia at charity events, on vacation, building a new life from the ashes of the old one. Finally, he turned to face her. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, highlighting how much these years had aged him. But his eyes, those storm-grey eyes that had once looked at her with such love, now held something between pain and anger. "Why are you here, Winslet?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with 4 years of unspoken words. She moved to the desk, needing its solid presence between them, her fingers trailing along the smooth wood. "I needed to know," she said finally. "About Marigold, about that night, about everything." "Now? After 4 years of silence, after I'm engaged to another woman, now you need to know?" His laugh was bitter, cutting through the quiet room like broken glass. "I know I have no right," she began, but he cut her off. "No right?" He moved suddenly, closing the distance between them until only the desk remained as a barrier. "You had every right. The right to ask questions, the right to demand explanations, the right to fight for our marriage. Instead, you ran. You disappeared without a trace, leaving me to pick up the pieces of a life you shattered." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. "I was young," she whispered. "So young, and so scared. And those photographs showed exactly what Marigold wanted them to show," he said, his voice softening slightly. "A manipulated moment, twisted to destroy something beautiful, and you let her win." "Tell me," she pleaded, "tell me everything." And so he did. The words poured out of him. Marigold's obsession, her careful manipulation, the photographer hired to capture moments out of context. He told her about the investigation he'd launched afterward, about finding the photographer who confirmed everything, about confronting Marigold only to discover the depth of her delusion. "She thought, if she could break us apart, I would eventually turn to her," he finished, disgust evident in his voice. "She never understood that what we had, what we lost, it wasn't something that could be replaced." Winslet sank into one of the leather chairs, her legs no longer able to support her. The truth of her mistake crashed over her like a wave, threatening to drown her in regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words feeling wholly inadequate. "I'm so sorry. I should have trusted you, should have fought for us, should have—" "Stop." His voice was gentle now, the anger replaced by something sadder, more final. "What's done is done. We can't go back." "Because of Talia," Winslet said, and it wasn't a question. "Because of Talia," he agreed. "She loved me when I was broken. She never demanded more than I could give, never pushed for explanations about why I kept your ring on a chain around my neck, never complained when I called out your name in my nightmares. She just stayed. That kind of love deserves loyalty." The words struck Winslet like physical blows. He still wore her ring. He had nightmares. Each revelation was another crack in the foundation of her carefully constructed reality. She stood on shaky legs, moving to the window where she had once watched the seasons change during happier times. The gardens below were covered in snow, pristine and untouched, like a blank page waiting to be written upon. "I never stopped loving you," she confessed to the glass, her breath fogging the cold surface. "I tried. God, how I tried, but every wedding dress I sold, every bride I helped, every happy ending I created for someone else, it all just reminded me of what I'd lost." "Don't." His voice was rough with emotion. "Please don't say these things now. Not when I'm trying to build something real with someone who deserves it." She turned to face him, really looking at him for the first time since entering the room. The years had changed him, shaped him into someone both familiar and strange. The boyish enthusiasm she'd fallen in love with had been replaced by a mature gravity, the light in his eyes dimmed but not extinguished. "Does she make you happy?" she asked, needing to know but dreading the answer. "She makes me whole again," he replied carefully. "Or as whole as I can be." The sound of heels on marble announced Talia's arrival before she appeared in the doorway. She looked impossibly elegant in a cream sweater dress, her presence both gracious and slightly uncertain. "I thought you might need these," she said, placing a tea service on the desk. The domestic gesture, so normal in its thoughtfulness, made Winslet's heart ache. This was Talia's home now, her life, her future. "I should go," Winslet said quickly, gathering her coat. "I'm sorry for intruding." "You're not intruding," Talia said softly. "Some conversations need to happen, no matter how painful they might be." The kindness in her voice was almost worse than anger would have been. Winslet looked at this woman who had healed what she had broken, who had loved what she had abandoned, and felt shame wash over her. "I really am sorry," she said, though whether she was apologizing to Dashiell or Talia, she wasn't sure. As she reached the door, Dashiell's voice stopped her. "The wedding is on Christmas night. My invitation stands." Winslet paused, her hand on the doorframe. "Why? Why would you want me there?" "Because some stories need proper endings," he said simply. "And maybe some ghosts need to be laid to rest." She fled then, unable to bear another moment in that room with its memories and its evidence of a life that had moved on without her. The snow had started falling again as she walked to her car, covering her footprints, erasing the evidence of her presence just as time had tried to erase her from this place. But as she drove away from the castle for the second time in her life, Winslet knew that nothing had really been erased. The truth she had learned today had only made everything more complicated, more painful, more real. The invitation, or was it a challenge, echoed in her mind. Christmas night. A wedding. A proper ending. But as she merged into city traffic, snow swirling around her car like lost dreams, she wondered if any ending could ever feel proper when you were still in love with the groom. Chapter 10. Internal Struggles. The week before Christmas brought with it a bitter cold that seemed to freeze not just the city, but time itself. 3 souls found themselves caught in an emotional web, each struggling with decisions that would alter not only their own lives, but those of the others as well. In her penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Talia Reynolds stood before her wedding dress, displayed like a work of art on its padded hanger. The ivory silk caught the winter light, transforming it into something ethereal. She reached out to touch the delicate fabric, remembering the day at Le Rêve when she had chosen it, the day everything had changed. She hadn't been blind to the electricity that had passed between Dashiell and Winslet. 4 years of loving a man who carried another woman's ghost in his heart had taught her to recognize the signs. The way his breath had caught when he first saw her, the tension in his shoulders, the pain and longing in his eyes. It was all there, written in a language Talia had learned to read too well. Moving to her window, she watched snow fall on the park below, transforming the landscape into something pure and new. She had always prided herself on being practical, on understanding the difference between fairy tales and reality. When she'd first met Dashiell, she'd recognized a broken man and had chosen to love him anyway, accepting whatever pieces of his heart he could spare. "You deserve someone who can love you completely," he had told her once, in a rare moment of vulnerability. "Love isn't always about completion," she had responded. "Sometimes it's about acceptance, about choosing each other despite the imperfections." But now, standing in her empty apartment with Christmas lights twinkling through the falling snow, Talia faced the hardest choice of her life. Did true love mean holding on to what you had, or letting go of what was never truly yours? Across the city, in his study at the castle, Dashiell Merrick sat in darkness, broken only by the glow of a single lamp. On his desk lay 2 rings, the platinum band he would soon give Talia, and the gold one he still wore. On a chain around his neck, Winslet's ring that he had never been able to part with. The contrast between them seemed symbolic somehow. The platinum band was elegant, practical, chosen with careful consideration, everything his relationship with Talia represented. The gold ring was passionate, impulsive, filled with dreams and promises, everything he had shared with Winslade. He picked up the gold ring, its familiar weight in his palm, bringing back a flood of memories. The night they met, her proposal in the garden, their wedding day when everything had seemed possible. Then the darker memories, the photographs, her accusations, the sound of the door slamming as she walked out of his life. "You never gave me a chance to explain," he whispered to the empty room, the words he had held inside for 4 years finally finding voice. "You just ran." But now she knew the truth, and that knowledge had shaken the foundations of the life he had carefully rebuilt. He could see it in her eyes when she came to the castle, the regret, the pain, the love that still lingered despite everything. Running his fingers through his hair, Dashiell faced his own truth. He loved Talia, her strength, her patience, her unwavering support. She had been his anchor when he was drowning in grief, his light when everything seemed dark. She deserved better than a man whose heart was split in two. But Winslade, God help him. Seeing her again had awakened something he had thought long buried. The passion, the connection, the way she could read his soul with a single glance. It was all still there, burning beneath the surface of his carefully constructed control. In her small apartment above the boutique, Winslade sat at her drawing table, sketching by lamplight as she had so often during sleepless nights. But tonight, her usually precise lines were shaky, the images flowing from her pencil reflecting the chaos in her heart. The truth about Marigold's manipulation had destroyed the foundations of her exile. For 4 years she had built her life on the belief that Dashiell had betrayed her, that running away had been her only option. Now that foundation was gone, leaving her floating in a sea of regret and what-ifs. She looked down at her sketch, not surprised to find she had drawn Dashiell as she remembered him from their wedding day. Young, hopeful, looking at her as if she were the answer to every question he had ever asked. Next to it, unconsciously, she had drawn him as he was now. Older, more reserved, the weight of loss and responsibility evident in every line. "I'm sorry," she whispered to both versions of him, tears falling onto the paper and blurring the lines. "I'm so sorry I didn't trust you, didn't fight for us, didn't—" Her voice trailed off as she realized she was apologizing to ghosts. The young, hopeful Dashiell no longer existed, and the man he had become belonged to someone else. Someone who had earned his trust by standing beside him when Winslade had chosen to run. Rising from her drawing table, she moved to her closet and pulled out a box she had kept hidden for 4 years. Inside was her wedding album, preserved despite her best efforts to leave the past behind. The photographs captured moments of pure joy, their first dance, their shared laughter, the love that had seemed strong enough to last forever. But it was the last page that held her attention. There, pressed between layers of tissue paper, was a dried rose from her bridal bouquet. The flower was fragile now, its once vibrant petals turned brown with age, yet it still held its shape, still carried the memory of that perfect day. Like the rose, her love for Dashiell had changed but endured. The passion of youth had matured into something deeper, more complex, shaped by regret and understanding. But was it too late? Had her mistake cost her not just their past, but any chance of a future? As midnight approached, 3 hearts waged silent battles with themselves. Talia stood before her wedding dress, questioning whether love sometimes meant letting go. Dashiell sat in his study, torn between obligation and desire, between the life he had built and the love he had lost. And Winslade remained at her drawing table, sketching scenes from a happiness she had thrown away, wondering if some mistakes were too big to be forgiven. The snow continued to fall outside their windows, covering the city in a blanket of white that seemed to muffle not just sound, but time itself. In this suspended moment between past and future, each of them faced decisions that would reshape not just their own lives, but the lives of the others as well. Talia finally turned away from her wedding dress, moving to her desk where pen and paper waited. Her hand trembled slightly as she began to write, but her heart was surprisingly steady. Sometimes she realized the bravest form of love was knowing when to step aside. In his study, Dashiell finally rose from his desk. Admit another guest. The scene was perfect, a fairy tale setting for what everyone assumed would be a fairy tale ending. Outside, snow fell in gentle swirls, adding to the magical atmosphere. Winslate's car pulled up to the castle entrance just as the cathedral bells began to chime, 7 o'clock. She sat for a moment, gathering her courage, watching as elegantly dressed guests hurried inside to escape the cold. The burgundy silk of her dress whispered against her skin as she finally stepped out into the snow, each snowflake that landed on her bare shoulders feeling like a kiss of destiny. Inside the chapel, the assembled guests murmured in anticipation. The orchestra began a soft prelude, the music weaving through the air like golden threads. Dashiell stood at the altar, impossibly handsome in his tuxedo, though those who knew him well could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand occasionally moved to his chest, where a gold ring still hung on a chain beneath his shirt. In the bridal suite, Talia stood before the full-length mirror, a vision in ivory silk and delicate lace. Her decision sat like a weight in her heart, but her face showed only serenity. The letter she had written to Dashiell lay on her dressing table, alongside her grandmother's pearls, symbols of a love strong enough to let go. The wedding planner appeared at her door. "It's time, Miss Reynolds." Talia nodded, gathering both her courage and her bouquet. But instead of moving toward the chapel, she turned to her assistant. "Please ask everyone to remain seated. I have an announcement to make." The murmur of conversation in the chapel died as Talia appeared, not at the traditional entrance, but from a side door near the altar. A collective gasp rose from the assembled guests. She was stunning, ethereal, the perfect bride. But she didn't take her place beside Dashiell. Instead, she moved to where a microphone had been set up for the ceremony. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice carried clearly through the hushed space, "I have a surprise for you." Dashiell turned to her, confusion evident on his face. In the third row, Marcus shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something unprecedented was about to happen. And at the back of the chapel, Winslate froze in the doorway, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone must hear it. Talia's eyes swept the chapel, finally settling on Winslate's figure in the shadows. "The real bride is here, not me." The silence that followed was absolute. Then whispers began to ripple through the crowd like waves on a pond. Dashiell stood motionless, his eyes finding Winslate in her burgundy dress, looking as shocked as everyone else. "Love," Talia continued, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to fall, "comes in many forms. Sometimes it's a quiet friendship that grows into something comfortable and safe. And sometimes—" she looked between Dashiell and Winslate. "Sometimes it's a force of nature that no amount of time or distance can diminish." She moved to Dashiell, reaching up to touch his face gently. "I've loved you for 4 years," she said softly, though the microphone carried her words to every corner of the chapel. "I've watched you try to rebuild your life, to move forward, to be the man you thought you should be. But I've also seen how you've never truly been whole, not since she left." Turning back to the assembled guests, Talia stood tall and proud, every inch the queen of her own story. 4 years ago, a misunderstanding tore apart two people who were meant to be together. Today, on Christmas night, I'm giving them both a gift, the chance to make things right. She reached for the microphone again, but her voice broke slightly as she called out, "Winslet, please come forward." The sound of Winslet's heels on the marble floor echoed through the chapel as she moved slowly toward the altar. The candlelight caught the tears on her cheeks, making them sparkle like diamonds. When she reached them, Talia took her hand and placed it in Dashiell's. "Sometimes," Talia said, her voice thick with emotion, "the greatest love story isn't about two people finding each other. Sometimes it's about the person who loves enough to step aside, who understands that true love means wanting happiness for those you care about, even if that happiness doesn't include you." The orchestra, sensing the moment, began to play softly, not the wedding march, but Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet Overture, the same piece that had played during Dashiell and Winslet's first wedding dance 4 years ago. Dashiell finally found his voice. "Talia," he began, but she shook her head, pressing her bouquet into Winslet's free hand. "I know what I'm doing," she said firmly. "I've known since the moment I saw you two together at the boutique. Some loves are written in the stars, and fighting against them only leads to more heartbreak." She stepped back, addressing the guests once more. "We've gathered here today to witness a union of two souls. Not the union you expected, perhaps, but the one that was meant to be all along." The priest, recovering from his initial shock, stepped forward. "Should we proceed?" Talia nodded, but before she could step away, both Dashiell and Winslet reached for her hands. "Thank you," Winslet whispered, tears flowing freely now. "I don't deserve this kindness." "No one deserves love," Talia replied softly. "It's not about deserving. It's about what is." She turned to leave, her head held high, but Dashiell's voice stopped her. "You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known," he said, his voice carrying through the hushed chapel. "You deserve your own kind of magic, your own great love story." Talia smiled through her tears. "Perhaps, but not all heroes get the girl in the end. Some of us get something better. We get to be the author of our own destiny." With grace and dignity, she walked down the aisle and out of the chapel. The assembled guests watched in amazed silence as this bride who was not to be showed them what true love really meant. As the chapel doors closed behind her, Dashiell turned to Winslet, finally free to love her completely. He reached beneath his shirt and removed the chain that held her ring, the gold band catching the candlelight like a promise renewed. "Dearly beloved," the priest began again, his voice stronger now, "we are gathered here today to witness not just a union, but a reunion, a love that was lost and found, tested by time and circumstance, and made stronger by the journey." The ceremony that followed was both similar to and entirely different from their first wedding. The same vows were spoken, but with deeper understanding. The same rings were exchanged, but with greater appreciation for what they symbolized. And when they kissed, it was not just a celebration of love, but a testament to the power of truth, forgiveness, and sacrifice. As the orchestra played and the guests applauded, snow continued to fall outside the chapel windows, covering the world in pure white, nature's way of giving them a clean slate, a fresh start, a new beginning. Later that night, after the reception had ended and the guests had gone home, after Dashiell and Winslet had begun their second chance at happiness, a single figure stood in the castle gardens. Talia looked up at the snow-filled sky, letting the frozen flakes mingle with her tears. But she was smiling too, because she had discovered something profound, that sometimes the most powerful love story isn't about getting your happy ending, but about having the courage to help write someone else's. To this day, the people of the town remember that Christmas night not just as a wedding, but as a testament to the many faces of love. They tell the story of the bride who gave up her wedding day, of the love that survived 4 years of separation, and of the power of truth and forgiveness to heal even the deepest wounds. And somewhere in the city, in an elegant apartment overlooking the park, a wedding dress hangs in a closet, not as a reminder of what was lost, but as a symbol of the kind of love that puts others' happiness before its own. For in the end, Talia's sacrifice became its own kind of love story, one that taught everyone who witnessed it that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. Subscribe if liked.